Greetings, friends of liberty. I did want to relate a recent occurrence of a medical nature that I had not a week past. Returning from a mission in France, I traversed some of the rougher streets and byways of the city, coming from the dockyards, and as I did, around 10 in the morning, I passed a huckster, a quack, selling patent medicines on the sidewalk. Stopping to observe his sales patter, I heard that, amongst the medicines whose universal benefits he touted were A. Godfrey's cordial, a tincture of opium and other ingredients, harmless enough when not overdone, B. Turlington's balsam, only God himself knowing the ingredients, C. Daffy's elixir, primarily consisting of alcohol made by Thomas Daffy the clergyman, and finally, portions of calomel in lumps containing mercury oxide. As I watched him, a young woman, it appeared not all of 16, approached, outlining her present difficulties with the crying of a febrile infant whom she needed to sedate so she could go to work. He recommended a bottle of Godfrey's cordial, that tincture of opium, and advised dosing the infant with as much as possible to keep it quiet, claiming this had no ill effects. She purchased the bottle, and he then also recommending the lump of calomel, claiming it would act as a sedative in high doses. At this juncture, I approached. "Young lady," I said, "might I have a moment of your time?" "Yes, sir," she answered, "but have I done something wrong?" "No, not at all," I replied, drawing her aside. "But I just overheard your conversation with this seller of elixirs. Might I give a word of advice?" "Surely, my lord," she replied. "Are these medicines not as you represented?" "Well, the difficulty is that Godfrey's cordial contains opium, which suppresses the breathing. So, while in low doses it is harmless, in high doses or repeated high doses, if an infant is having difficulties in breathing, it can cause breathing to stop." Putting her hand to her throat, her eyes wide, she gasped, "No." "Yes," I said, "I overheard this lack of caution. One must be chary of his advice. Doctors report that too much of the cordial, if you'll allow me, does not make infants more cordial." Her eyes twinkled. "I thank you, dear sir, and am much obliged." "Also," I added, "with regard to the calomel in high doses, the mercury it contains can poison infants, so this too should be avoided, at least in high doses, as a sedative." "Then I am doubly grateful to your kind advice," she responded. "'Tis my pleasure," I smiled at her. "Any effort to spare us a misfortune is well worth our time." I smiled again, and nodding, tipped my hat, and waving briefly, continued on my way. She returned my wave with a smile, and giving the quack a frown and disapproving look, hurried in the opposite direction. Now if we turn to the issue of competence in medicine, in your own 21st century in Britain, over 2 centuries hence, we find Amanda Steane's horror movie equivalent, Who Cares? One family's shocking story of care in today's NHS. In this memoir of disaster, Miss Steane describes rank NHS incompetence, the hospital to which her husband was brought time and again damaging him, resulting in a chain of catastrophic untold consequences. She begins at the very end by describing his suicide, how she had awakened at first to hear his raspy breathing, but then, after checking on him, went to the kitchen to let the dog out. How, upon returning, she heard nothing and rushed to his side, finding him dead. How she saw the 2 empty packages that had contained 40 pills of MST, a modern heroin derivative, he having taken 20 times the normal dosage. How she called 999 for the ambulance. And finally, how she was terrified at the thought of life without him after over 24 years of marriage, during which time we'd hardly ever been apart. But still, I was happy and relieved that the nightmare was over for him, finally. The first step in Paul Steane's death was his admission to an NHS hospital in May 1999, with blood in his stools and very bad diarrhea. Paul had earlier in 1980 developed chronic rheumatoid arthritis, which ran in his family, and diabetes as well, perhaps because of having taken steroids to treat the arthritis. In hospital, Amanda noticed his condition deteriorating and that he was twitching and becoming confused and sleepy all the time. A doctor to whom she had mentioned these symptoms ordered a blood test which showed complete kidney failure due to dehydration. All of this was caused by one very simple factor. He had been taken off the IV 8 days before and since then not given enough water. Mistake number 1. As Amanda says, I had just assumed that the doctors and nurses would take care of his basic needs, such as the 2 liters of fluid that an adult needs each day. What I found so disturbing was that if I had not insisted on his blood tests, he would have just passed away in the night and I would have been told that he had died of kidney or heart failure. Mistake number 2. While in critical care, Paul wasn't given pressure stockings, so he got a clot in his legs, and so was then given a blood thinner. After going home, Paul then developed difficulty breathing. Part of that blood clot had moved to his lungs. Possible mistake number 3. A specialist advocated slowly decreasing the blood thinner. Soon Paul developed pain in his left foot, with several of his toes going blue, the little toe being the worst. It was off to the hospital again. Mistake number 4. Back in the hospital, Paul started getting confused again, for the second time. When a doctor arrived, Amanda told her my fears that Paul might be going into renal failure again, so the doctor ordered blood tests. I couldn't understand why none of the staff had noticed the signs that were so obvious to me. Why hadn't he been put on a fluid chart? The test confirmed that Paul was going into renal failure again. I was furious. Given repeated failures to maintain fluid balance, the next day the renologist wrote in very large letters in red ink, "This patient suffers with renal impairment," in the hope that there would be no more mistakes. Amanda wrote to the CEO outlining Paul's treatment by them and his specific medical needs. Within a month, Paul was back home again. His toe, with a likely clot, had developed gangrene, and so he's scheduled for surgery. Given that the CEO hadn't yet replied to her letter, Amanda called his secretary and emphasized the necessity of water for her husband in his upcoming visit. Mistake number 5. After Paul had his surgery and was in pain, the doctor on call claimed he couldn't be given more than 30 milligrams of MST. Amanda explained that he was given that twice a day at home to control his pain. The doctor, however, claimed that his file was too big, so he didn't look through it to confirm that Amanda was right, and so didn't give him more medication. When Amanda arrived the next day, even though Paul had been given more MST, there was no fluid chart, with Paul himself saying that he hadn't drunk water since the early morning. Amanda got incredibly angry and explained for what seemed to be the 100th time about his renal impairment. Subsequently, the hospital gave Paul the fluid chart to do himself. Paul, having returned home finally after surgery, he immediately was sweating profusely and had severe lower back pain. Returned to the hospital, they discovered yet again, for the 3rd time, that Paul had been in kidney failure when he was discharged the previous evening. Mistake number 6. In the hospital, Paul stopped breathing, so the doctor made an incision into Paul's neck so that he could put a central line into the main artery. They were breathing for Paul and setting up drips and injecting drugs, fighting hard to keep him alive after having him in the cardiac unit for 8 hours without realizing that for the third time he was near death due to kidney failure. Paul's heart stopped on numerous occasions, they constantly reviving him. When Amanda next saw him, he was on the ventilator with a pacemaker inserted into his heart and a dialysis machine for his kidneys. In all, there were about 13 drips going into his ports in his arms, neck, and groin. Mistake number 7. The CEO finally responded, claiming falsely that Paul's renal function was already beginning to improve the first time he had had renal failure. This simply wasn't true. Amanda subsequently saw the CEO eating lunch in the cafeteria, walked over to him, and asked for a meeting, he postponing it to next week. Amanda replied, "Okay, as long as you can guarantee that Paul will be alive next week. At the moment, they are only giving him out from hour to hour, and I wanted you to see him." As time went on, not only did the foot, from which Paul's toe was amputated, not recover, but his other foot started deteriorating. Amanda lifted the bedclothes, looked, and thought, "Oh my God, his whole left foot was dead, the flesh hanging rotten and black. I had never seen anything like it in my life." Mistake number 8. For the longest time, the team in the intensive care didn't notice the type of bed sore that he had, an old scar that had opened with the opening going all the way to the vertebra itself. This caused intense pain. Incidental mistake number 9. A senior doctor doing the rounds with interns told him that Paul's condition had been caused by diabetes. Amanda said, "I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but finally I couldn't take it anymore." "Excuse me," I said, "I don't like to interrupt you when you were talking with your students, but this happened because he was dehydrated in the hospital and went into renal failure. He then had to be put on life support, including noradrenaline. That cut off the blood supply, and that's what happened to his legs." The doctor just stood there staring at me and then looked at the students. They all seemed quite embarrassed. This same doctor later didn't send a piece of Paul's foot to the pathology lab, but had it destroyed. Mistake number 10. They gave Paul the wrong sedative, medication, one time, but fortunately, no harm resulted in this instance because he told the nurse that it tasted different. Paul's condition slowly improved with no loss of memory or mental sharpness, despite his brain having been without oxygen at one point for 6 minutes. However, he nonetheless lost some visual acuity, making reading harder. But the most serious problem was a stridor, a scarring of his windpipe due to the ventilator. After about 2 weeks at home, Paul's breathing became so bad that, they not being able to get an appointment with a specialist, Amanda called an ambulance to have him readmitted. There, the doctor on call took one look and decided on an immediate tracheotomy. After lunch the next day, with an operating room finally open, the lead surgeon decided that the surgery should be done without any anesthetic. 2 doctors had to hold Paul down, one on each side, while the surgeon cut Paul's throat open, a 3-inch slit, and forced the tube into his airway with his hands. The lead surgeon said afterwards, "In all my 43 years in the medical profession, I have never seen anything so barbaric." Further complications arose when more ventilator damage and narrowing of the windpipe was discovered. This meant that he couldn't presently use a speaking tube. The expectation, however, was that this damage would heal. Mistake number 11. When they finally again discharged Paul from the hospital, they only gave him 1 day of dressing for his tracheotomy slit, he needing dressing for 5 days. At this point, with Paul not being able to walk or speak, Amanda said, "He had told me long ago that he wouldn't want to live if he couldn't walk and talk. He repeated those feelings to me, and I was shocked." For example, when people couldn't lip read what he was saying, he would get frustrated and felt like a non-person. He also stated his wish not to be resuscitated if he ever went into a coma again. Paul became very dependent on me, following me around the house and never letting me out of his sight. Because he couldn't walk, he was afraid that if his tracheotomy tube did block up, as it could, he wouldn't be able to summon help in time. Mistake number 12. They finally had an appointment scheduled with the CEO. At the meeting, the surgeon who amputated Paul's toe asked why Amanda thought the hospital had done something wrong, so she told him the obvious. Paul's fluid balance was not monitored when he was admitted for his toe amputation. The CEO, for his part, after the surgeon had left, denied this, pulling out a blood test that appeared to show Paul's blood values were fine when he was discharged, with Paul's creatinine level at 126, the norm being 60 to 120. But Amanda noticed that this blood test was done 36 hours before Paul had been discharged. When they drove home and afterwards, she contemplated suing them. Amanda then got a lucky break. A nurse from the hospital called, telling her that there had been another blood test done later, in the hours before Paul left the hospital, and that this one clearly showed Paul's creatinine having risen from 126 to 200, a definite indication that he was going into acute renal failure. Her GP, who received copies of the second test, said he felt let down and embarrassed by the hospital. A second meeting with the CEO found him much more conciliatory. Amanda said there was no more rocking in his chair now. Shockingly, the CEO had been made aware of this second blood test a week before his first meeting with them. The liar. Further complications developed with Paul's windpipe, with the tracheotomy tube aggravating the tissue, causing it to form a white lump which moved up and down with his breathing, obstructing it. Paul then, feeling more and more depressed with not being able to walk or talk, broached the subject of his suicide again to Amanda. He was sure that he wanted to do it, and so the thorny question of how they would broach the topic to their children arose. Finally, one evening, Amanda just blurted it out. Paul wanted me to tell you that he doesn't want to live anymore. There was stunned silence, and it went on for what felt like several minutes, the children then talking with their father. She comments, I couldn't stand seeing my husband and both my sons so emotionally wrecked. Mistake number 13. Paul had to go into the hospital yet again when he developed severe stomach pains, with his blood sugar levels also much harder to regulate. Amanda said, Paul asked me to promise him that I wouldn't take him to the hospital, but I told him I couldn't do that. Once admitted, they were actually cared for by a grateful nurse who had attended one of the workshops they both gave. But nonetheless, A, the nurse didn't realize that if his trachea tube became blocked, he would suffocate before a nurse likely would arrive to clear it, since B, Paul's arthritic fingers weren't up to the task of clearing it themselves. Amanda had to explain all this to her. In the end, Amanda was given 24-hour access to Paul, which was good, but which he partially resented since they were expecting her to do their job. When was she supposed to sleep or go home? Mistake number 14. Paul was given morphine for his stomach pain, but since this NHS hospital, as usual, was understaffed, Paul at one point had to wait 2 hours in agony until a doctor arrived, with the nurse and the doctor very apologetic. Later in the night, he had to endure a similar wait. Of course, if the doctors had simply prescribed oral morphine, which both nurses and Amanda were allowed to give him, there would have been no wait. Amanda had to suggest this obvious solution herself. Mistake number 15. The hospital put a big white sticker on Paul's file saying, litigation pending. This caused at least one doctor to be much more hesitant on operating on him. Upon Amanda complaining, the hospital removed the big white sticker. Incidentally, Amanda was sometimes asked why they kept going back to that hospital. Her reasoning was that A, there was no reason to think that this hospital was any worse than any other, and B, by now most people at the hospital were familiar with Paul and his needs, or at least should have been. After another 7 weeks of being in the hospital, they let Paul go home again since his condition had stabilized. Mistake number 16. Paul was scheduled for a barium enema to try to resolve his intestinal difficulties, but the prep instructions that the hospital sent didn't take into account, after they had treated him for over 2 years, that he was a diabetic. Upon Amanda going to the hospital to complain, they confirmed that the wrong test had been ordered for Paul and issued a new one straight away. Finally, Paul's death. When Paul went back home, he would say to Amanda, for example, "I haven't any hope anymore. Don't you understand? I want to be in control of my own death, not them. They have done enough to me without taking that away from me too. If I left it to them, I would probably die in tremendous pain or very scared and choking in a hospital ward." Part of Paul wanted to wait for the legal compensation process to finish so that they could both get the large compensation he deserved, but the other part of him hated living now, and given that Amanda would still get some compensation anyway, there was less motivation for him to want to live much longer. Amanda, however, got him to promise to not commit suicide before Christmas. At one point, Paul, to drive Amanda away, told her he didn't love her anymore, but a visiting social worker helped her understand that this was just a ploy on his part to try to emotionally distance her from him. Otherwise, Amanda said that he pulled me down with him and I was finding it increasingly difficult to go on taking care of him when I got no thanks for it and when he was so often abusive. When, for example, she would suggest that they would go out, he said, "I'm not going. Don't you understand? I don't want to go anywhere. I want to die." On the 19th of January, Paul indicated that he would do it in the next week. Amanda broke down crying. She's saying, "Tears were never far from my eyes, but I didn't know how many more of them my body could produce. I was simply sick and tired of crying." The night before he committed suicide, Paul suggested that, given his noisy breathing, it would be better if she slept in the living room, which she did. Then, sometime during the night, he took his overdose of 40 MST pills. After she discovered his body and the 2 envelopes he had left for her and the children, the ambulance came. She wanted it to take his body to another hospital, anyone but that, but the coroner said that wasn't possible. Amanda's book speaks for itself. I would only add 2 remarks. First, the NHS is socialism in medicine, and socialism always fails. This is the result. Secondly, no man could ever have asked for a better wife than Amanda, who constantly fought for her husband's life and happiness, who time and again confronted the NHS with their failures to give Paul better care, but who both, in the end, were defeated by the incompetent system of healthcare that the NHS is and always will be. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.